My guest again today is Martin Durkin. And the last time you were on, I think Climate the movie had just come out. And what's new since then?
Oh my goodness. Well, the biggest thing that's new since then is the launch of a new YouTube channel called Guerrilla Science. We've now, I don't know how many films we've produced, about 50 or so, or something like that. So that's been hard work and a steep learning curve. Very different from making documentaries, which, as you know, I spent most of my time in my life doing. So the shorter films out on the internet, it's sort of, it's hard work for a number of reasons. First of all, because you have to produce quite a few of them. And second, because it's a big old place, the internet and online, and getting your voice heard is very hard. I'm used to sort of making a documentary that goes out on TV or things like that. That's terribly easy. But now there's the rough and tumble of the ideas marketplace that we're fighting in. So it's a challenge.
So one thing I think that must be good for you is having the freedom of all different lengths of films, that you can make little tiny ones. You can make a longer one if you want. You don't have to worry about time so much.
Yeah, and it's been, because I've worked in TV all my life, it's quite an unlearning experience in a way. You've got to stop thinking in TV terms. I think we started producing films that were like short TV programs, and that doesn't work. It takes too long, and it's not really the kind of grammar of online stuff. So we had to learn how to do that differently. But we're getting the hang of it. The nice thing is you can go to much greater depths on stuff. You know, in Climate the movie, we touched upon so many things. In Guerrilla Science, we're able to unpack that and go into much greater detail. And people seem to like that.
I saw that you got some praise from Tony Heller, which I think is wonderful because I respect him so much, about the stuff you did about hockey stick.
Yeah, no, that's another thing we've been trying to do is draw together lots of stuff that somebody really, there's a great deal of excellent climate skeptic stuff out there on X, on Tony's website, on Anthony Watts' website, on CO2 Coalition, bundled together in No Trick Zone, all loads of different places like that. But we thought, as you know, one thing that we could bring to the party, as it were, was a bit of that, documentary TV stuff, pull it together, make it a bit more presentable, and present it in a slightly more easy to view form. So 4 graphs, your film, the graphs that lied, things like that. We're drawing on a lot of existing stuff, but we're packaging it in a slightly new, more exciting, accessible way, I guess.
And then you're open to comments from people, right? In the replies or YouTube comments. I think you've had some good ideas already coming in from people that have watched your stuff.
Yeah. People say, "Oh, we like this, but cut the music out." In TV, you kind of plaster music all over the place. But now, people don't like the music so much. People like the longer pieces. People like the more thoughtful pieces. So that there's a thing going out today, which is a much longer piece. On the kind of historical origins of the world state, looking at who started talking about that and who was pushing for that and why, which I think is part of an indirect part of the climate thing, I guess.
Yeah.
So yes, sorry, the comments are really, really useful and sometimes quite funny.
So you're incredibly well read, I think, and that helps you tie in this whole climate propaganda, the scam, with the wider picture of globalist control of our lives and elite control of the new class, all that stuff.
Well, the thing is, I've been thinking about it very particularly since the late 1990s, because it was in 1997 that I remember at the time I was already working in TV, and there was a wonderful head of science programming at Channel 4 in the UK called Sarah Ramsden, who rang me up and said, here's this great book by, what do you think about environmentalism? And I said, well, I'm holding it a bit in. I'm a bit suspicious about it. because they claim to be radical, but they seem to want to stop development, in the third world, and so which doesn't seem, that seems a very conservative thing. It was a very radical progressive thing. And she said, "Oh, have a look at this book by Greg Easterbrook. What about doing a series on it?" And so that's when I started thinking about it. And I guess in the process of doing that, I've ended up reading very widely into green stuff as well. I think one really key thing, if you really want to understand the climate alarm, the green agenda, read their books. You've got to read Schumacher's Small is Beautiful and Goldsmith's The Way and all the big classic green texts. And some of the more recent books, and it's really enlightening. You think, "Oh my God, now I understand how they click." And going back, looking at the origins of those ideas historically, that's terribly fascinating as well. And so I ended up, you end up going down rabbit holes, and so the connection between environmentalism and fascism, Nazism, which is incredibly, they're not just connected; they're pretty much part of the same movement. That was incredibly fascinating, and the origins even further in the 19th century of Romanticism and Wokeism, that rejection of capitalism, which takes the form of nature worship and so on and so forth. I just sort of I kept reading around that, so I was interested, I suppose, in the politics and economics and history of the green movement and all that kind of related to it. And so I've been being incredibly boring about that for years, which has sort of helped in a way. It hasn't helped me being very interesting company at dinner parties, but
I would say you are. I've seen you at dinner parties.
Yeah, but we go to very special dinner parties though.
So you understand how they think because you were one of them, right? With your Marxist background.
Yeah, but from the tender age of 14, I started to get into Marxism and got sort of sucked into that in a big way. I came from a kind of working class family and industrial area in the northeast of England. My father was a coal miner, and I worked in a rope factory, and I thought this is, but for whatever reason, I sort of got into left politics and Marxism, and that's been really useful because I went I was deep into that as well for many years. I was quite an active Marxist and read an awful lot of political and economic theory back then, and I suppose that helped because you sort of understand the left from the inside. You understand all the arguments, you understand the weaknesses, you understand every time someone would challenge you, you'd know the areas that made you feel a bit uncomfortable because you weren't really, you couldn't really answer that. But and then another chapter, I suppose, in my life was when I left the Northeast, came to London and went to university and realized that Marxism was terribly popular there. I was thinking, I'm going to be this radical rebel Marxist. I thought, oh my God, you can't, I'm like a pig in shit here. Everyone's a Marxist. The university, professors and things fawned after me because not only was I a Marxist, but I was from a working class background. So I was this kind of, oh, look at him. And I suppose the sense of unease began to build there of, what all this was about. But it was really when I started to look at the green movement that I completely thought this stuff's actually garbage and this is rubbish. Not only is Marxism rubbish, but the green movement made me realize that it was a lie. It was a huge lie. The people who were on the left were not on the side of the working class, and the Greens were quite explicit about this. They don't want material progress. They don't want individual freedom. They don't want all the things that actually ordinary people aspire to and want, and the rest of it. And so that started to become front and center of my thinking, I suppose, in my criticism of the green movement and my understanding of the whole climate shenanigans. Sorry, that was a bit lengthy, and I didn't meant the answer to be that long, but yes, I started off on the left, in short.
So you made this point, I think it's such a great one, that when you go to these left-wing protests, these environmental protests, whatever, you don't see the plumbers and the working people there. That's just not a thing, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, not one of them. I remember it occurred to me, I went to one in Blackheath in London in the late 1990s, and it first struck me, there was not a single person there that I could spot, that I could say, they look as if they've got a proper job. They were all university lecturers or students, or looked as if they were just wandered out of, the coffee bars of art galleries and all this sort of thing. They were the intelligentsia, broadly speaking. And they weren't just, in Britain, we have different ways of describing class in America and Britain. In Britain, working class is a bigger category for us, and middle class is a smaller category of posh folk. But even you couldn't even say they were middle class, because there was one section of the middle class that wasn't there, and that's the commercial middle class, the middle class from the private sector. There were no bank managers, there were no fishmongers, there were no tradesmen. They were a particular wing of the middle class, which doesn't really have a name. I've been trying to give it a name, but it doesn't really have a name other than the new class. No one. It's not a very commonly used phrase, the new class, but it was this particular section of society I realized that was at the heart of the anti-capitalist movement, at the heart of the Green movement, and it was people from this class that got angriest with me whenever I said anything skeptical about climate.
Do you have hope for the UK? I think you just tweeted out that reform is doing well. Do you think there's some hope that sanity can come back into the UK and manufacturing even?
I think there's probably got to be an economic collapse in the UK for there to be any progress. I think the government debt is such that I think people have just got to stop lending to governments. I think people have got to say, they're not creditworthy. We're not going to do it anymore. These are not safe investments. Because governments are out of control. I mean, governments are, I think, across the Western world, with the exception of Donald Trump's, administration in America. Even there, I mean, I'm sad that Donald Trump hasn't gone further in challenging the general consensus at the moment that the answer to everything is a big state and huge amounts of spending. Because that's what the West has become, massively state-controlled and massive amounts of public spending. And that class, the new class, is obviously the class that's really pitching for it, because they are a class of tax consumers. They are a class who benefit from increased regulation because they are the regulators, and they are involved directly or indirectly in regulation, in analyzing, and so on and so forth. Or they benefit in some way from state spending. So they love it. They love it. And they're voracious. They want more and more and more and more. And if they can't tax us enough, they'll borrow. And if they can't borrow enough, they'll print money. They will do anything in order to keep ratchet up how much the government spends and what the government does. And reining that back, I mean, Milei has, started doing it in Argentina. But, where are the copycat governments that are sort of doing similar things elsewhere in the West? That's what we must hope for. But in the UK, it's a terrible situation at the moment, both in terms of free speech, in terms of the economy, in terms of the dominance of the new class in the UK. They've managed to get in to power mainly electorally because of the split between Tories and Reform at the last election. But by golly, they're causing havoc. And, in theory, they can carry on for another 4 years before there's another election. So Britain could go down really far before it starts to come back up again. But there is, as you say, optimism in the sense that ordinary people are really becoming conscious of what the game is and becoming increasingly angry. One thing that the new class has done is they've lost support from the working class in as much as they ever had much. They've been using immigration to try and shore that up. And so if they let lots of people sort of come in from elsewhere and give them the vote, they can rely on, the increased support from that direction. And you can see that that's where their pools of support are, where you have big immigration into an area, they get increasing support, and they're very conscious of that. But there's really a big backlash now in Britain against And it's not just on the immigration front, but I think people are understanding that a lot of these issues hang together: climate, economic stuff, the debt. There's an increasing consciousness that there's a coherent worldview which is held by the public establishment, which is alien to them and which is against their interests. And so the encouraging thing is that X is really useful in encouraging that. I think it's given people a voice who didn't normally have a voice, and the bits are starting to be joined up. So I'm encouraged that ordinary working people in Britain, what you might call working class or commercial middle class, those sorts of people are on the march mentally, as it were. And so Reform UK, which is, I think, a very admirable party. It's just, I think in a recent poll, it's now twice as popular as both Labour and the Tories put together. Until 5 minutes ago, Labour and the Tories were the two dominant parties.
So, yeah, you're quite a student of history, and there might be some parallels between what's going on now and the fall of the Roman Empire, maybe. But do you think that we can get out of this without a dramatic collapse? Or if there is a dramatic financial collapse, what do you think that'll look like?
I think there needs to be something really radical, because I think the problems that we're facing actually have been building for 100 years. The state has grown. I mean, in the film that we're putting out today, we chart it from the end of the First World War. I mean, if you want to look for the greatness of America when it's really at its most dynamic and exciting, then you've got to look at the 19th century and the early 20th century. That's when it's really firing on all cylinders. And it's with the steady creep, the growth of the state that really starts in the 20s and 30s, kicks in a big way with the New Deal. The Second World War encourages further expansion of government. In the post-war, there's a great post-war boom, but hovering in the background there is the creeping power of the state, and it's just grown and grown and grown. And that class of tax consumers who adore a bigger state has grown and grown. It's grown in influence. Dominated the university system. American universities didn't used to be this left-wing. With the growth of state spending into universities, that has grown. Culturally, they've expanded. They've pretty much controlled the media. The media didn't used to be as left-wing as it is. All of that stuff, the growth of that class and its power has grown and grown and grown for decades now. And it's not just going to disappear as an election. A vote isn't going to do it. And even the election of Donald Trump, it's kind of Donald Trump is depicted by the left as this big figure that's sort of powerful. Actually, he's a little David fighting a Goliath. The monster that he's taking on is much bigger than him. It is the entire public sector in the US. It's the entire education system in the US. It's enormous. It's the third sector in the US. It's all the NGOs. It's the entire university system. It's probably the public school system as well. He's taking on pretty much the entire American intelligentsia, the entire publicly funded American establishment. Dismantling that establishment, disempowering that class is a monumental task. I mean, that is huge. I mean, we're talking about, cutting public spending by half, that sort of thing. This isn't Milei has cut public spending in Argentina by a third. That's the sort of scale of change that needs to take place, I think. And even Donald Trump, who I have, a great deal of admiration for, it doesn't feel powerful enough to do that at the moment. But what I think might happen is that the burden of debt, certainly it looks like it might be the case in France and Britain. I mean, we're looking at France and Britain going bust, the public regime in those countries going bust. And that might shake things up because, if you default on your debt, if you've got to go cap in hand to the IMF for a bailout, as if the IMF had enough money to bail anyone out on that level. But then suddenly there is no choice. There is no money left. they would have to print money on the scale of Weimar Germany in order to get out of that mess. And so I think that probably what's going to happen is there's going to be an economic crisis of some sort, and then governments will have to cut furiously. Will have to cut spending, in an extraordinary fashion, and then out of that political turmoil, then may come change. But it's going to be we're changing direction of an entire society. We've been on one trajectory for the best part of a century, and we're kind of saying, okay, this whole thing is rotten. The whole thing is supported by a class of people who are maniacs. They come across, they depict themselves as the grown-ups and the clever ones and the rational ones, but they're maniacs. They spend like there's no tomorrow. I mean, you look at the figures in France at the moment, more than 40% of new French debt is being taken on by the government to pay for pensions in France. Now, the idea of a pension, as you know, is that you save and save and save in your lifetime while you're working, so that you can afford not to work but still consume when you're older. On a social level, they're now borrowing from, look, what they're paying pensioners today in France are going to have to be repaid by taxpayers, young taxpayers in the future. That is the absolute, obverse of what's meant to happen, both in economic terms and also morally. Why are you expecting people who are working today to pay yesterday? People, why didn't you save up? Why didn't you put that money aside? The scandal of government in terms of pensions is that, of course, they say to individuals, you're too feckless to save yourself, so we're going to save for you. We're going to tax, and we're going to put it in this pot, and then when you retire, we'll give it to you. They do nothing of the sort. They tax you, that's fair. They don't put it in a pot. They blow it on their mates in the public sector. And then when it comes to paying back the pensions, oh, what do you know? We're going to tax, but we're going to borrow. These people are maniacs. The people who run our public establishment, the civil service, public administration, the politicians, they're feckless, irresponsible, stupid, greedy, and yet they're in charge. They are the public establishment. These are the people, by the way, who are way behind the climate alarm. They are knee-deep in climate alarmism. It's their thing. The climate alarm was produced by them. It's supported by them. It's promoted by them. It's defended against fierce critics like us, by them. They're the guy. They are the people that are up, and they are the ruling class. They're the people in charge. We call it a democracy, but how do you vote these buggies out? They're not up for election, by the way. They don't say we're going to put all the civil servants up for election. We're going to put all the NGOs up for election. We're going to put the university professors up for election. They're sitting pretty. You can't get rid of them. The bureaucrats you can't get rid of. In the EU, you can't put those buggers out of power. So the change that's required is enormous. And I think I can't see it coming about without some massive dislocation or crisis.
So I have a list of 7 movies here that I'm going to read off. I'm going to put this in the show notes too. 7 of your movies, I've watched all 7, and I think if people would watch those, it would be a better civilization. One is The Great Global Warming Swindle in 2007, Climate the Movie in 2024. Then you did Britain's £1 trillion horror story in 2010, which is about some of the stuff you just talked about. Fantastic. You did Margaret Thatcher, Death of a Revolutionary, 2013. You did Brexit the Movie in 2016. A Great American Race Game in 21, and Guns and Freedom in 22. So I highly recommend those. It's fantastic work. And you must have really learned a lot just digging so deep into making a movie about it. You really have to understand your subject if you're making a movie about that subject, right?
You do. And it's one of the delights of making a film is that it forces you to think about something even when there's an area that you think you know about, if you actually have to reproduce it as a film, then it forces you to think that much harder about it and to clarify your thoughts about it that much more. So it's nice. And when there's also an aspect of guerrilla science, as we've discovered, you need to dig deeper. You need to know what you're talking about, because you're going to have people throwing mud at you and criticizing you. And what you don't want is to make some real howler of a mistake. So it forces you to think, it forces you to clarify your thinking, Alec.
Do you think the people outside your window there living on your street, have they watched some of your movies? Do they have opinions on what you've done or not?
Yeah, yeah, and obviously it's my films tend to be quite divisive. So, I get, people who, completely adore them and are on board and very enthusiastic about them. And I get people who really, really, hate them. And, I live in an area of North London, which is a, particular stronghold of the nucleus. And my wife, mixes in those circles. We know, people who are academics and so on and so forth. So for the most part, I feel like I'm a traitor in their midst. This kind of someone a turncoat. So I oftentimes you go into dinner and she said, "No, you will just shut up, won't you, please?"
Do you do it?
I mean, I try, but then, Sarah says something completely asinine and you can't help saying something. But the interesting thing is as well, you've got to shut up completely, because people know if you say something on this particular topic, they kind of can tell, oh dear, you're probably bad on that, you're probably bad on that, you're probably bad on that. It's weird the way these things hang together. And once they sniff a rat in one corner, they realize something. And this is why I wanted to. A lot of the films that we've done on guerrilla science are talked about class. And it's something Americans are very reluctant to do, for very admirable reasons, because, America is a place where there's been so much social fluidity that your background didn't matter. And so they don't like talk about class because they don't like people being put into boxes, because individual freedom sort of is that it sort of decries that kind of categorization. But actually, in order to understand what's going on, I think you need to talk about class, because it's such an important part of the picture. If it wasn't for class, you would go up to an individual and say, "Oh, you believe in global warming, you think it's a terrible crisis, let me show you this evidence." And that individual would say, "Oh, yeah, I didn't realize that. Oh, thank you for pointing that out to me." But that doesn't happen. What tends to happen is, if you go to someone and you say, "Look at this evidence," they bristle. They don't like it. They don't want to be told. They don't want to hear what you're saying, and they even hate you for saying it. You're a climate skeptic. You're one of them. You probably like Trump. You probably like so. This belief in the climate alarm, is actually part of a bigger thing, and it's part of the group identity of the people who sort of buy it. And to understand that really, inevitably you're talking about class. What is that class of people? Why do they think in this way? Because it really doesn't. It's if you go to a dinner party and people are saying they think the world's going to come to an end, and you say, guess what, guys, it isn't. They should say, "Oh, fantastic! Hey guys, listen to Mountain over here. He says we're going to be all right." This is it. No. Like I say, do you realize what that character said at dinner? He's obviously a skywag. Why is it that they need the climate alarm? Why is it that why they're defensive about the climate alarm? And why do they not want to hear any evidence? It's not. So in order to explain that, you've got to get into what are the kind of class dynamics behind this belief.
Didn't you say there is some sort of dynamic in your local area, maybe about some sort of 15-minute city type stuff about restricting traffic flow or something based on some climate BS idea? Wasn't there something about that?
There's lots of that around here. We've got roads being cut off. We've got congestion zones where you've got to try, get charged for driving into a particular area. You've got 15-minute cities springing up where you're not allowed to drive into certain areas. They're absolutely pummeling you if you drive a car. In terms of tax, they want you out of the cars, so that there's you really feel almost under siege and picked on if you have a car, and if you want to drive about the place. It's becoming increasingly difficult, and ordinary people really resent it, because ordinary people do jobs where you need cars. Ordinary people, things like window cleaners, and a tradesman, and they come and fix things and deliver things and all that sort of stuff. And their jobs are being made impossible in London because you've now got to, it takes you an hour to drive what used to take 15 minutes. There's this assault on ordinary people. And I have this conversation frequently with Simon, my window cleaner, who, he see in the streets, you have these fit, young, left-wing cyclists who work in the media buzzing along on their bikes thinking this is the way to go, everyone should ride on a bike, and you just think these buggers, they fashion the world in their own image according to their own interests, against the interests of the great mass of people. And to go back to your point about reform, that's what's happening. My window cleaner and many other people are thinking these people are against us. This is a form of class war. When the Greens say that mass production is awful and how disgusting it is, and mass consumerism is awful, we're the masses. We're the ones for whom mass production is happening. We're the ones who are the mass consumers. This is actually an assault on the prosperity of ordinary people. It's that what calls itself socialism is in fact an assault against the working class, against the middle classes. They've got us in their sights. And, what I hope to do with guerrilla science, or what we can do with guerrilla science, is really emphasize that, really sort of push that message home.
So that's interesting. So there is a class of people that are riding their bikes around and feeling like this is the way we should live, and it's preventing bad weather. That's why they think that the plumber shouldn't be able to drive his truck on the same street at the same time. That's what they're thinking.
I don't even know if they think it prevents bad weather. I think that, that it is remarkable how unthought through this is. But there is definitely a coherent leftist worldview which is utterly entrenched in the university system, which a lot of public school teachers have, which a lot of people in the public sector or the third sector have. And climate is part of that suite of beliefs. If you really challenge them on it, most of them don't know anything about climate. They haven't got a clue. They really don't know. They'll come out with, it's obviously getting hotter and getting worse and all that kind of thing. But there's no science behind what they say. And as I say, they're not happy when you point out to them that the actual science doesn't stack up, and this is a false alarm. They want it to be true. They want it to be true. So they're not scared, really. I think that they love it. They love it.
I think I've only talked to one of those guys in real life at some conference or something. And right away, as soon as I mentioned the climate thing, he completely dropped that and said, oh, I don't like riding my bike because the fumes of the trucks get in my nose or something. He didn't even want to talk about the climate scare. Got it interesting.
Yeah. I think it's a bit like a lot of forms of class consciousness. You hang around with their friends and all their friends are saying the same thing and their workmates are saying the same thing. And so they don't have to think it through because they're never being challenged by it. Everything's just being affirmed and reaffirmed. They read The Guardian or they do it. And because they live in their particular class bubble, it just becomes, the truth, the unbridled, unquestionable truth. And this is not just on climate, a hatred of Donald Trump. If you, I did a lot of work in America on the media front. We did lots of shows for American TV stations. So I used to hang around a lot with TV executives in Washington and New York and so on and so forth in LA. Nearly all of them left wing. I'm trying to think of any of them that might have been described. One was a kind of libertarian, a bit round the edges, but for the most part, they were left wing. And everyone they worked with was left wing. And everyone they went to dinner parties was left wing. And everyone they knew was left wing. And so that was the intellectual air that they breathed was the hatred of Donald Trump, accepting climate change, thinking public spending was a good thing. All of that raft of kind of woke stuff, thinking that white privilege. Slavery is pretty much the only thing in history that you need to concentrate on. All of those things, it was, that kind of part of that. And they don't want it challenged. They're not used to it being challenged. And they are offended if you try to. to challenge it. You're just an alien being if you criticize it. You're outside their group. It's that kind of visceral and emotional. They hate you. They hate you. The people who criticize your podcast, they really think you're wicked and evil. It's a bit odd when they actually meet you sort of face to face or have to do, because then it's harder to demonize you when they're actually talking to you, because actually you're a nice chap, and you're quite thoughtful. But generally speaking, you're the devil. You're outside their gang. That's why it's a class thing rather than an individual thing. It's not just accidental that this view happens to hang, with that view. It's that there's a logic to it hanging together, and that's really what I mean when we're talking about class. It's understanding that logic. It's understanding why those issues combine in a person's mind.
It's
and why it
interesting.
gains moral force as well, because they think you're bad. Tom, they think your podcast is wicked. They think that I'm wicked. They think that guerrilla science is wicked. I think the algorithm thinks that guerrilla science is wicked, which is why we're not getting more views. That's one of the terribly frustrating things. And why they've got that sign on the top whenever you watch one of our films. The UN says that this following film is complete nonsense from start to finish. There's a moral duty to put that sign on to say that we're wrong. I mean, that's amazing. Think about it. And we kind of take it for granted because it's been there for some time. But there's an actual sticker they put on the front of your film in this free society, which says the following film is just factually incorrect. No one's watched it, but because it dares to, the computer hints, this can smell climate skepticism, bang, untrue sticker goes on the top. It's outrageous.
Yeah, that blue thing is pure disinformation. I am waiting for it to go away because YouTube has loosened up on the whole COVID thing quite a bit. I thought that they might come to their senses in other areas, so we'll see. But I have another observation I live in this crazy blue area in Minnesota. Minnesota is a blue state, a lot of crazy left-wingers here. But I think COVID has woken people up in that. At the start of this whole COVID thing, when the gene therapy came out, you were so evil if you didn't take it. And now the new numbers came out, and like 78% of the people here are not up to date. So 78% of the people have flipped to, well, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe the gene therapy isn't something I want to take. I think that has woken some people up. And again, a lot of people have come up to me in person and said, I used to believe everything the TV told me, but now with COVID, there were so many lies that I'm looking into stuff like climate and other things more. That gives me a lot of hope.
I think that that is encouraging, but I still think that we should not ever expect university professors. There's that great chart of the political affiliation of university professors in top American universities, and it's nearly all blue. Tiny little slither of red, few more red in the engineering department, but generally they're all red. That's not going to change.
No.
COVID's not going to change that. Nothing's going to change that. The education system is this relentless left-wing machine that will not change. We'll get. I think we're not going to really persuade anyone from that class to join our class. What we can hope to do is to make our class more effective in understanding what's going on and more effective as a fighting force, as it were. I'm increasingly seeing things in almost military terms of war. It's a battle. It's an absolute battle. And our side is, we've been too naive. We've been too disconnected. We haven't understood the nature of the fight. We need to get our act together. If we're going to win, if we're going to defend ourselves, and this might sound hyperbole, but I don't think it is. I genuinely think it's a question of defending individual freedom, defending the kind of society that was being built in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries, that really exciting, modern, free, dynamic society that America shone out. I mean, Britain pioneered to a considerable extent, but really America was the shining example of that society. We're really trying to get that back, to defend what's left of it and to build on it and get back that society in full measure. And we really need to understand what we're doing in order to pull that off. We need to be more articulate about it. Our analysis needs to be better. We need to be able to identify the enemy better. We need to understand the nature of the fight better. And that's a big old task. but very necessary, I think. But to on your point on COVID, that helped. That helped because disabusing people of this faith in the authorities and the experts is really important, because the new class are the experts. They are the people in that position. So the less these people can pose as neutral, disinterested experts who are only managing us in our own interests, the less we can allow them that veneer of neutrality, the better.
So I totally agree that we're never going to win over the aging hippies, the left-wingers. They're going to go to their grave like that. But I'm very encouraged by the polling here in the U.S. Of young men and how unwoke young men are all of a sudden. That's super encouraging because they're going to be around a long time and they've got a lot of energy and they're going to be very influential. And this already could be one of those things about that old saying about hard times create good men or whatever it is. Yeah, there's a lot of people that are in early 20s right now that I think are going to be great sources of realism in the future.
Well, I think I think there's really good science here too. As I say, the sad thing in Britain is that an election is 4 years off. So my God knows what we're going to do in the next 4 years. But at the moment, reform, which is, I suppose, the equivalent of the Donald Trump, MAGA movement in the UK, is massively popular. It's polling, as I say, more than twice the levels of popularity as Labour and the Tories combined. I mean, it is enormous. I mean, that kind of lead is almost unheard of in the polling history in the UK. So there's a massive groundswell of anger and support for what you might call UK Trumpism. And that is, and a lot of that's coming from young people. The Labour Party have been toying with pulling off this trick of reducing the voting age to 16 on the assumption that 16-year-olds will be, really left wing. But actually, there is absolutely no guarantee that that's going to work, because a lot of young people are coming out in support of reform. So there is, I've always thought that if you really want good common sense, go to people who are not in the university system, maybe have never been to university, but who have proper jobs. There's still good sense there. It's just that those people tend not to be the people who work in the mainstream media, who run publishing houses and so on and so forth. So you don't get to see them in that public realm, if you like. That public realm is dominated by the enemy. But beneath, there is a seething mass of angry, good common sense, which hopefully will come out.
I just heard in the last year or two that in Germany, they opened up voting to younger folks with the idea that they were going to go left, and they were shocked when they didn't. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that happened in Germany, but it's music to my ears.
So do you think the real battle is left versus right? Or I'm hearing people saying that's not really the way it is. It's maybe the working people against the new class, or it's even truth versus lies. Or what do you think the real battle is?
I think it's both working people versus the new class and truth versus lies. I understand we have the truth on our side and they have lies on their side. And that might sound terribly black and white and dogmatic, but I'm willing to argue it for hours, because I think we're objectively on the side of truth and morality. I mean, I honestly think my heart and mind is in this battle, and I think we're on the right side. But I don't think it's not left and right in the way that we used to think of left and right. Because in the olden days, the left were meant to be on the side of the masses, on the side of the workers. Actually, I don't think they ever were. But it's quite clear now that the left are against the mass of working people, or against the masses. And they're quite explicitly against the masses. They're against mass tourism. They're against mass consumption. They're against mass production. They're against mass society. They're against the masses. That's why, by the way, there are no workers turning up at those climate rallies, because they know that this rally is against them. And that's why there's very little working class support, actually, for left-wing parties now. They're meant to be the parties of the working class. But look at the Democrats in the US. They got remarkably, I think, something like twice as many blue-collar, white, working-class Americans vote Republican as vote Democrat. Clearly, the left is not the party of the workers. And the right, we used to depict as, well, they're the upper classes and they're against the workers. But actually, if you define pro-capitalist parties like the Republicans or Tories or Reform as right, workers are absolutely flooding in that direction. They're absolutely blinking love all that. So the old left-right descriptions, are untrue. They're absolutely untrue. And any analysis of green socialism, much, really rams home the fact that it's untrue. Socialists are snobs. You can't buy working people. This was quite clear, by the way, in the Brexit campaign as well. The people who really loved the European Union, who loved government by, university-educated bureaucrats, they loathed the vitriol against ordinary people who were threatening to vote Brexit, because there was a big class divide in Brexit. Working class and commercial middle classes like freedom, and they like, control of their own lives. They don't want to be governed by a large foreign bureaucracy that's unelected and they can't get rid of, handing down laws that they have no say in and can't change. They didn't want that. But the new class, absolutely, that's mother's milk to them. That's what they absolutely adore. So the new class was really in favor of the EU. Working and commercial middle classes were against it. The snobbish scorn poured on that group, on what ordinary working people, by the Remainers, the people who want to say, it's extraordinary. They can't stand working people. This is the left. And in fact, in the film that we're releasing today, might be released now, we look at, early socialists, the Bloomsbury Group, H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, all those people in the 20s and 30s, all of them snobs. Snobs not just thought the working class were scum, but believed in eugenics. They believed in, sterilizing them, even wiping some of them out. I mean, they were taught that, this was the stuff that led to, Mein Kampf and the Nazis. But, they were vicious snobs. So I think it's not a left-right thing in the sense that on the left we see the working class. On the left we see the socialist intelligentsia, who bloody hate the working class. And on the right, oddly enough, you actually see the working class. Ordinary people, and we've done films about this, on guerrilla science, ordinary people, I think, have a particular attachment to self-reliance, common decency, family values, doing well by your neighbors, doing well by your spouse, having an ordinary sense of humor, just saving, working hard, not getting into too much debt, all those really basic common sense values that are now deemed right wing. The government not being too intrusive, the government not telling us what to do, the government not looking after us, because we know that it's never that sort of thing. So that suspicious, all that stuff that's right wing actually is quite lower class, as it were. It's commercial class, it's part of the private sector. It's what the left hates. But it's the old, how we used to think of left and right, that's all. I think it was always rubbish, but now it's obvious rubbish.
So let's talk a little bit about Brexit, the movie, because I watched it many years after the fact. I was so late to that party, but I thought it was very convincing, and it was very influential, right? It must have been a satisfying thing for you to do that and have Brexit pass.
Yeah, no, it was the biggest single bit of pro-Brexit propaganda in the referendum, and we may have swung it. I mean, our people have been nice enough to say that the film was key in getting us over the line and winning the Brexit referendum. So I sort of like to think that it was, but there's no way of telling. But anyway.
Fantastic movie. So another thing I wanted to bring up is just the whole Joe Rogan thing, or the whole new media thing, I think is so healthy. And every time I say something optimistic, people say, oh, you think we should stop fighting because we haven't won already. But I'm saying something optimistic here because Joe Rogan, I'm not saying I believe what he says, but he had both Coonan and Dessler on there talking for maybe hours each. I think that is incredibly healthy, that you let both sides just let it rip, and we got to hear everything that those guys had to say. I think we win for sure if we hear both sides. If we hear just from the Desslers, which is kind of the mainstream media, then it's a huge problem. But anyway, I think this whole new media thing where people can hear at great length from both sides, I think it's wonderful.
I think it's wonderful. I mean, look at your podcast, and your podcast actually gets many more views than Guerrilla Science, so I look enviously on. But hopefully Guerrilla Science will build. But you have put out, you are the main podcast for Time of Skepticism. Before the new media world, you'd no way you would have been allowed to do any of that. The stuff we're seeing on Guerrilla Science in the old media world, even though I used to make documentaries, I wouldn't have been allowed to say any of this stuff. I have a freedom now. I mean, obviously that freedom comes with the prices. I'm having to struggle to get the view count up and things like that. Hopefully that will happen. But that freedom is absolutely wonderful. And all the Joe Rogan stuff, the Ben Shapiro's of this world, and all, a lot of these characters, I might not agree with absolutely everything all of them say, but the fact that they're out there and they're all, finding a voice and finding an audience is great. That's why Reform is doing as well, because the clutch that the BBC in particular had over the media in the UK has been loosened. GB News is a new force in politics, but I don't even GB News would have been able to take off had it not been for X and YouTube, for all of the efforts of YouTube to stifle debate. But I think it's really exciting, and it's I'm like you. I'm an optimist. I feel a bit weary sometimes. Also, is where you live. If you're in Britain, you'd be a bit more bleak because it's really hell at the moment. I mean, it's just awful. You just think, what has happened to this country? But hopefully, we'll come out of it.
So are you worried that we're in some sort of golden era of internet freedom right now, and the man is going to find some way to make us all have digital IDs, and if we say the wrong thing, they're going to cut off our access? I don't see how they could implement that, but do you have worries about that?
I think that, again, I think that you're probably more optimistic because you're in America. I honestly have the occasional daydream where I think, I wonder whether I should just move to America, try and get American citizenship, claim to be a political refugee or whatever. But get out of Britain, and because I think America is, and it has been for a long time, and I think it still is the great hope for freedom in the world. There are other countries where there's people are enjoying freedom, but not with the clout, not with the power, not with the authority, not with the self-confidence of America. You've got Donald Trump in there at the moment, but if at the next election, if Democrats somehow sneak in, don't be too complacent in America. Don't be too complacent. I think that there's a risk that you think, well, we're free and all that sort of thing. If you look beneath the surface of what's been happening in America, the growth of the public sector, the growth of the third sector, the growth of a huge left-wing public establishment, I think you need to address that, because I think that America, even though you're a shining beacon, there's danger there too. But I think that you're probably more optimistic because you're in the States, and I'm probably more pessimistic because I'm in London right now. You keep thinking, surely they're not going to do this. Surely they can't get away with that. Surely people won't accept that. But then these things, keep happening. There's a law that they're passing about, called the banter law in pubs. If you're overheard saying something which could be deemed offensive to the staff, that's going to be a legal offense. Can you believe that they're criminalizing what you say over a pint in a pub? You'd have thought a few years ago that is never going to happen, but it's happened. You'd think you're not going to be put away for 30 months for a slightly wild tweet that you then apologize, you immediately retract and apologize for because it went a bit far. But no, Lucy Connolly went down for 30 months for saying something in a tweet. These things which you say, surely that's not going to happen. Sure enough, it goes and happens. So it's least likely to happen in America, but I'd say don't be too complacent.
So that pub thing blows my mind. That's actually right now it's in force that you can get in trouble for saying the wrong thing in a pub.
Yeah, look it up. The banter bill.
Yeah,
It's been
I heard.
Yeah. And it's it's really sinister. It's really sinister. And already we're being told what the different colored bags you've got to put your rubbish in. If you put the wrong rubbish by, it's an offense. It's an offense this, it's an offense that. And it's all done in the name of looking after us and looking after the planet and looking after the climate and all that sort of thing. But the encroachment on civil liberties is immense. There's been this big dispute with Apple because the British government wanted access to all private communications in the UK and said to Apple, we're going to charge you, we're going to fine you £20 million a day if you don't give us access to, and happily JD Vance is stepping up and saying, look, by doing this, you're actually getting access to the communications of US citizens, and this is not acceptable. If it wasn't for America, we'd have total government access of all our communications. This is, we're in dangerous territory, and we really are in dangerous territory. And people mustn't ever think it can't happen here, because it did happen here. Fascism happened here. Communism happened here. Europe was the birthplace of both fascism and communism. And those instincts on the part of the ruling classes haven't gone away. They describe them differently, they color them differently, they present them differently, but they're the same authoritarian urges, and they're no less strong.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I was just reading a book whose name escapes me about history and the collapse of civilizations. And a common thread is people thinking, can't happen here. We're going to be fine.
Germany, who gave us Beethoven and Goethe and Hegel and Kant and, a byword for civilization. And they produced the Nazis. And also the most civilized people bought into the Nazis. And who else admired the Nazis? John Maynard Keynes. Who admired Mussolini? The architects of the New Deal. Never imagine that it's so barbaric, that little stuff, that it's dead in the past, won't happen again. It's a real and present danger.
Another movie of yours that's fantastic, Guns and Freedom. It leads me to believe that the Second Amendment is incredibly important in the U.S. that to stop something like that from happening here. I bet you would agree with that.
Oh my God! Listen, and it's connected with the First Amendment. I've often been tempted to put on X, we need guns, we need a Second Amendment. But I know if I made that tweet, I'd have police at my door.
Really? You really would?
Yeah, they would say this is an incitement to violence. Security, you can't. I'm scared to argue now for a Second Amendment in the UK, lest I have the cops at my door. So I cannot underline enough. And I know you've had an awful shooting in Minnesota recently, and that that's absolutely tragic and upsetting beyond words. Never, never, never conclude from that it's a wise idea to get rid of the Second Amendment, because all of your freedoms depend on that, on the reality that Americans can defend themselves and can't be picked on, that no government can go beyond a certain point because they know that the populace itself is dangerous and is able to fight back. Never get rid of that. And I don't think that the UK would be doing what they're doing now if we had a Second Amendment in the UK. In Switzerland, they have guns. What's the freest country in Europe? Switzerland. The two go together. I can't emphasize enough that it's when a populace is armed that a government feels constrained from, really intruding into their lives and really listening into all their conversations and sending police round if they put up an England flag. You put an England flag, you'll have the police coming around to. We're in England. Imagine in America if you put an American flag up and the cops come around to give you a warning. That's what's happening in Britain today. People are putting up England flags, and you see it on X. They're now, because people are feeling really militant about it, they're going to roundabouts. You have roundabouts in
yeah, we do.
They're drawing the St. George's Cross, that's the England flag, white with a red cross. They're going and surreptitiously doing it before the cops come. they're putting them up, the flags up, lampposts, and the cops come and take them down. You'll get arrested if you're caught, shoving up England flags. It's got to that level in England. If we were armed, if ordinary people had guns, I don't think that the British state would be acting in the way that it is at the moment.
So you can tweet what you want in Switzerland and they don't come to your door, I guess?
Yeah, I don't live it. I mean, I don't live in Switzerland, so I'm not Irish, but it can be pretty damn sure that they don't do that. I think surveys of regulated societies find that the Swiss is always the least regulated society in Europe. Even then, the trouble is they're surrounded by the EU, and so even the Swiss are sort of coming under pressure. We're trying to push ahead with guerrilla science, and I guess everything that we've talked about is sort of the logic of why we've expanded from climate into other areas with guerrilla science. But yeah, I hope that even a proportion of the viewers you get on your podcast might take a look at guerrilla science and see what it's like. We're trying desperately to make the channel take off even more. That's hard at the best of times, but I think when we've got an algorithm which isn't very friendly to climate skepticism, I think it's doubly hard. TikTok, we're doing quite well on. I noticed that the graph that lied, your film on the 20th century temperature graph, it's like 7,000 likes on TikTok and 355 comments, which is fantastic. So I think that maybe the TikTok algorithm isn't quite as aggressively anti us as the YouTube. So we must do more for TikTok. The trouble with TikTok is you're going to do smaller pieces, obviously. And our aim at the moment is to expand and do longer pieces that do deeper dives. And the new film is one of those, but it's all a matter of experimenting.
And there's lots of places to watch the guerrilla science stuff. They're on X, Rumble. They're kind of everywhere. YouTube, lots of places.
Yeah, the main films are sitting on YouTube at the moment, but everything is, we're experimenting as we go.
Very good. All right, I will let you go, but thanks a lot, Martin Durkin. I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, what you're continuing to do.
And I'm a huge fan of yours, as you know.
Fantastic. Life is good. All right, we'll talk to you next time.
Cheers. Thanks, Tom.